The shriek of steel against steel was a sound that did not belong, a jagged, wailing cry that split the night wide open. It was the kind of noise that stopped hearts mid-beat, that turned routine into catastrophe in the space of a breath. And then, chaos. The train lurched, an enormous beast thrown from its path. Velvet seats became treacherous. Bodies slammed into each other, the genteel hush of the first-class compartment torn apart by screams, gasps, the wrenching groan of metal twisting where it shouldn't. Miss Agatha Marple, small and unassuming in her corner, felt herself lifted then thrown. Her knitting basket went tumbling, a spool of scarlet thread unraveling wildly as it spun through the air like spilled blood. For a few eternal seconds the world tilted, rattled, then shuddered to a stop. And then, silence. The kind that only follows disaster, heavy, thick with disbelief and settling dust. Somewhere, a man groaned. A woman sobbed softly into her gloved hands. The brass lantern overhead swung in a slow, hypnotic arc, casting shadows that moved like ghosts along the compartment walls. Miss Marple exhaled, bracing herself as she reached out, steadying Mrs. Hardwick, whose trembling fingers clutched at her pearl necklace as though it might anchor her to the living. "There now, dear," Miss Marple murmured, her voice soothing yet firm. "Still in one piece, are we?" Colonel Hardwick let out a grunt, pushing himself upright with military efficiency, brushing dust from his jacket with the kind of irritation reserved for mild inconveniences. "Blasted nuisance," he muttered. "What the devil happened?" Anthony Winfield, the wiry young clerk with ink-stained fingers, fumbled with the window latch. His breath fogged the glass as he peered out. "We're off the rails," he announced, voice tight. "Looks like we hit something." Beyond the cracked glass, the countryside was dark and endless. Smoke curled from the engine, rising in thick ribbons into the cold night air. Sparks flickered along the rails where the first-class carriage had derailed at an awkward angle, tilted just enough to make every step feel unsteady. A sharp rap against the door. The conductor, his cap askew and his face smudged with soot, pushed it open. "Everyone all right in here?" His voice carried the kind of brisk efficiency reserved for people who had not just been in a train crash. The passengers exchanged glances. No immediate fatalities. A few bruises, some torn silk, and more than a little shaken dignity. "Best get moving," the conductor continued. "Nearest place to take shelter is Applecross Station. Not much, but it'll do till we sort things out." At the name Leonard Penderton, the station master who had boarded at the last stop, stiffened. Miss Marple saw it. A hesitation, small but telling. His gaze flickered to the window, then away just as quickly, as if something out there troubled him. She smoothed her skirt, bending to retrieve her knitting basket from where it had landed. A spool of red thread trailed away into the shadows. "Applecross Station," she repeated softly. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in some time." Penderton cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "It's old," he said, finally, as if that explained something. "Mostly abandoned, not much there." Miss Marple tucked a stray curl behind her ear, her sharp blue eyes following the silhouettes of passengers picking their way toward the distant glow of the station lights. "Yes," she said lightly, stepping out into the night. "But sometimes it's the empty places that hold the most secrets." The air was damp with the chill of evening, the scent of wet earth rising beneath their feet as they trudged toward Applecross Station. The building loomed ahead, a skeletal thing in the darkness, its once grand facade now half swallowed by creeping ivy and years of neglect. The waiting room's cracked windows glowed faintly, light flickering like a candle struggling against the wind. The station's old sign, hanging at an awkward tilt, creaked against the breeze. Applecross. Beyond the platform, the tracks stretched into nothingness. A dead end. Miss Marple glanced at Leonard Penderton again. He stood rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward the far end of the platform, where the shadows were thickest. Something about this place unnerved him, and if Miss Marple had learned anything over the years, it was that fear always had a reason. Somewhere in the darkness, something was waiting, and before the night was through, she suspected Applecross Station would have one more passenger, one who would never leave. Station loomed its silhouette dark against the sky. Waiting, the first thing was the rain. A slow, deliberate drizzle that had no interest in hurrying along. It wasn't enough to soak through, just enough to settle into the bones, to make everything damp and uncomfortable. The kind of weather that made a man irritable, a woman testy, and a mystery just a little more inconvenient. They came out of the wreckage like actors stepping onto a stage, one by one shaking off the shock, brushing at coats, adjusting hats. The train lay at an odd angle, wheels half sunk into the soft wet earth beside the rails, smoke curling sluggishly into the night air. Colonel Hardwick was the first to speak because of course he was well. "Don't just stand about," he snapped, straightening the lapels of his great coat. "Move along. No point gaping at the thing." His wife Eloise flinched at the sharpness in his voice, but said nothing. She never did, not in public. She pulled her coat closer around herself, the pearls at her throat, a pale shimmer against the dark wall, a few feet away. Anthony Winfield adjusted his spectacles with unsteady fingers. The clerk was small, wiry, and always nervous. The kind of man who looked like he owed money to someone at all times. "Where exactly are we?" he asked, voice tight. Miss Marple gave him a look, mild but precise, between where we were and where we intended to be. She said, "Who, though at present I'd say we're slightly closer to trouble than destination." Beatrix Lansing let out a sharp breath, exasperated. The woman had the kind of poise that suggested she always expected someone else to fix things before they could become her problem. "Well, we can't stay here, can we?" she said. "Surely someone should be coming for us." "They will, madam," the conductor muttered, "but not soon enough for my like." His lantern swung in slow arcs as he surveyed the distant dark beyond the wreck. The landscape stretched out in rolling hills and patches of trees. No roads, no houses, nothing to suggest civilization. "Except there," Miss Marple said, pointing far ahead across the wide rain-darkened field. A station sat nestled like an afterthought against the endless stretch of track. ATR Station. A faint glow flickered from within light shelter, and if Miss Marple was not mistaken, a man standing just inside the doorway, watching. "Well," she said, brushing at the damp on her gloves, "I suppose that's where we're going." The colonel grunted, already stepping forward. "Come along then." No doling, rather ironic. "Don't you think?" Miss Lansing muttered, falling into step beside Miss Marple. "A railway station that looks as if it's been left behind by time itself." Miss Marple smiled, a small knowing thing. "Well," she said, voice light but firm, "sometimes the places time forgets are the ones worth remembering." And with that they trudged through the misty dark toward Applecross Station. Waiting, the station loomed. Ahead, a squat, forgotten relic, its stone walls darkened by decades of cold dust and neglect. Applecross Station had the look of something once grand, now left to sink into obscurity, like a retired prizefighter grown soft with age. The sign above the entrance was cracked. The lettering faded to a whisper of what it once had been. The drizzle had settled into a fine mist by the time the travelers reached the platform. The wind whistled through broken eaves, rattling an old schedule board that still clung to its rusted frame. The timetables it displayed were yellow, the last updates years old. Miss Mar's gaze moved slowly across the station. There was a quiet about the place, but not the kind that welcomed, the kind that listened. A single lantern burned near the entrance, throwing long uneasy shadows just beyond its reach. The doorway gaped open like a mouth, waiting to swallow them whole. The first movement came from the side office. A shuffle, a hesitation, and then Mr. Leonard Parton emerged. He was tall, but stooped, the kind of man who had once demanded presence, but had since shrunk into himself. His uniform was faded, the buttons dulled, the sleeves frayed, deep lines carved furrows into his cheeks. His thin lips pulled into something that wasn't quite a scowl, but certainly wasn't a smile. He blinked at them as if their presence had disrupted something. A dream, a memory, something best left undisturbed. "We had an accident," the colonel barked, stepping forward like a man still used to. Giving orders derailed. "We need shelter." Pemberton's fingers twitched at his side. His hesitation was brief, but Miss Marple caught it. A flicker of something in his eyes, something that wasn't just surprise. He wasn't just startled, he was alarmed. "Right, Parton," said finally. His voice had the gruff sandpaper edge of a man who spoke little and cared less. "Come in." Then he stepped aside, holding the door as the group shuffled into the station. Inside the air was thick with dust. The scent of oil lamps and damp stone lingering, like ghosts of the past. The booking hall stretched wide before them, its vaulted ceiling cracked with dirt. The counters were empty, the ticket windows long since abandoned, but there had been something here once. Miss Marple's eyes swept the walls where old photographs were still nailed into place. She drifted toward them, running a gloved fingertip across the wooden frame of one. The images were faded, but not beyond recognition. One showed Applecross in its prime, the platform bustling, well-dressed travelers, boarding steam engines, porters, rushing with luggage. The next was a portrait. Younger Leonard Parton standing proudly in his crisp station master's uniform. There was something in his face back then, something almost defiant, as though he had once dared the world to take something from him, and the world had obliged. Parton cleared his throat. "Ain't much, but it'll keep the rain off." Miss Marple turned, her expression placid, but her eyes sharp. "Yes," she murmured, "I imagine this place has sheltered many things." Parton didn't answer. Outside, the wind howled through the broken rafters, and somewhere deep within the station, something creaked. The waiting room at Applecross Station had seen better days. Then again, it had probably seen worse too. The air carried the stale scent of coal dust and damp wood, the kind of smell that clung to a place long after it had been forgotten. A rickety wooden table stood in the center, the surface scratched and uneven, surrounded by mismatched chairs that groaned in protest. When sat upon the fireplace, large but neglected, coughed out more smoke than warm. An oil lamp flickered from a wall, scone throwing long exaggerated shadows across the cracked plaster walls. Parton stood over a small iron stove boiling tea in a dented kettle, his shoulders hunched, movements mechanical. The station master wasn't a man accustomed to guests, and certainly not a dozen stranded travelers looking to be made comfortable. Miss Marple, seated in a high-back chair by the fire, watched him with mild curiosity, hands folded neatly in her lap. She never minded a bit of dust, after all was honest. It simply settled where it was left alone, and so did secrets. The colonel was less forgiving. "Is this the best you can do?" Man Hardwick barked, pushing his tin cup away as if it contained poison instead of weak tea. "You're telling me there's nothing more to eat?" Parton didn't turn from the stove. "That's what I'm telling you." Mrs. Hardwick flinched at her husband's sharp tone, lowering her gaze to the murky liquid in her own cup. She always made herself small when he was in one of his moods. It was an old habit. Beatrix, glancing, let out an exaggerated sigh, running a gloved finger over the edge of the table before inspecting it with disdain. "My dear Colonel," she said, shaking off a speck of dust like it had personally offended her, "surely you didn't expect a 5-course meal in a station that hasn't seen a train in a decade. The state of this place is an absolute disgrace." The colonel muttered. "Yes," Miss Laning murmured, reaching for a small sandwich from the platter. Tone had unceremoniously dropped onto the table. It's positively barbaric. She took a delicate bite, then grimaced. And so is this food? Pemberton snorted, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. You want caviar, lady? Yours. About 50 mil too far from the Ritz. Winfield, perched at the edge of his seat, fidgeted with his coat pockets, as though checking for something, perhaps, to make sure it was still there. His fingers, stained faintly with ink, moved with precision. Miss Marple caught the movement and tucked it away in her mind, along with all the other quiet details she had gathered since they arrived. Winfield had a secret, that much was clear, but then again so did everyone at this table. The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable kind. It was thick with unsaid things, the sort of pause that existed when people were too polite or too afraid to say what they were really thinking. Miss Marple reached for her tea, sipping carefully. The china cup was chipped. The tea itself was lukewarm and uninspired, but she had drunk worse in her time. Her eyes drifted between Hardwick and Poln. There was something unspoken there, something brittle, the way they avoided each other's gaze, the way Poln gripped the kettle too tightly, the way Hardwick bristled like a man expecting an argument that hadn't started yet. Miss Marple had seen that kind of tension before. It wasn't the tension of strangers, it was the tension of people with unfinished business. The wind had picked up outside, making the station's rotting wooden beams groan like an old man shifting in his chair. The rain had stopped, but the damp still clung to everything, the air thick with the smell of wet stone, decayed wood, and something else, something stagnant. Inside, the waiting room had settled into a strange hush, the kind that wasn't quite peace, but rather a collective unease. The fire in the ancient hearth had dimmed to embers, casting flickering shapes onto the walls. Miss Marple had seen nights like this before, nights when the air held secrets just waiting to be spoken aloud across the room. Colonel Hardwick paced, hands folded behind his back, the rhythmic clack of his shoes against the warped floorboards, the only sound. He checked his pocket watch for the third time in as many minutes, snapped it shut with a quick flick of his wrist. His jaw was set tight, his shoulders was squared like a man bracing for impact. Last inconvenience, he muttered, though it wasn't clear if he meant the derailment, the station, or something else entirely. Mrs. Hardwick, seated stiffly on a low bed chair, reached for his arm. Robert, please, there's nothing to be done now, must simply wait until morning. Her voice was calm, plating, but Miss Marple didn't miss the tremor beneath the even tones. Hardwick shook her off, sharp, impatient. You think that, do you? His gaze darted to the dark windows, the station's empty corridors. Beyond, nothing to be done. That's what you always say. Mrs. Hardwick flinched, small but noticeable. Miss Marple, knitting forgotten in her lap, watched without watching. The Hardwicks had a history that ran deeper than mere marriage and duty. She had seen couples like them before. Two people found not just by a shared past, but by a shared secret. Robert. Mrs. Hardwick tried again. Softer this time. We are all in the same predicament. There's no use working yourself into a state. Hardwick exhaled sharply, but didn't answer. Instead, he resumed his pacing, muttering under his breath. Miss Marple caught two words, quiet but distinct: old debts. It wasn't long after that Miss Marple rose from her seat, stretching as though wearied by the evening. In truth, she simply wanted a better look at the station. The others were settled, Beatrix, Lansing, leafing through a magazine. She clearly had no interest in Anthony Winfield, hunched over, still fidgeting with his coat pockets, and Peyton, the station master, watching everyone from his place near the door, his face unreadable. Miss Marple slipped out into the corridor. The station was silent, save for the occasional moan of the wind pressing against the windows. The long hallway stretched ahead, lined with dusty doors leading to forgotten offices and storage rooms. She stepped carefully, her small frame moving with the kind of grace that goes unnoticed. and then movement, a shadow at the far end of the hallway. A figure hunched near a door, one hand on the rusted doorknob, the other rooting through his pockets. Anthony Winfield, Miss Marple, took one step closer, just enough for her shoe to scuff against the wooden floor. Winfield froze, his head snapped up, eyes going wide behind his crooked spectacles. "Mr. Winfield," Miss Marple said, her voice pleasant. "Curious, you seem to be having some difficulty there for a moment." The clerk didn't move then. In a quick, jittery motion, he stepped back from the door, shoving his hands deep into his coat pockets. "Mrs. Marple," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Didn't see you there, miss." Let the silence stretch between them, observing the way his shoulders tensed, the way he licked his lips. "Nervous tick. Door appears to be locked," she remarked, lightly. Winfield nodded too quickly, glancing back at the door, as though hoping it would explain itself. "Ah, yes, it does seem to be." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet you were quite intent on opening it." His fingers twitched in his pockets. "I was just stretching my legs, got turned around. That's all." She smiled small, and knowing I see, Winfield swallowed, nodded again, then hurried past her, retreating toward the waiting room, without another word. Miss Marple watched him go, then she turned back to the door. "Records office." She pressed a gloved hand to the wood, feeling the cold seep through. There were secrets here. Secrets that people were willing to lie for, and perhaps secrets worth killing for. The wind outside had grown teeth, rattling the windows like a hungry thing, trying to claw its way inside. The lanterns flickered against the gusts, throwing wild shadows that danced across the walls of the waiting room. Mrs. Hardwick sat stiff-bead in a wooden chair near the half her pearl necklace, gleaming faintly in the low light. She reached for her tea, then stopped, her fingers hovering over the handle. Her gaze swept the room, once then again, her mouth pressing into a thin, uncertain line. "Robert," she called, her voice not quite as even as she meant it to be. Silence. Her fingers curled around the arms of her chair. "Has anyone seen my husband?" The others exchanged glances. No one had noticed him. Leave Beatrix Lansing looked up. From the magazine she had been pretending to read, he was pacing near the fire, not 10 minutes ago. Anthony Winfield, still damp from his earlier misadventure in the hallway, frowned. "I thought I saw him checking his watch again." But that was before he hesitated, adjusting his spectacles. "Before you got lost in the corridors," Miss Marple finished for him, her voice mild. Winfield swallowed. "Yes, I suppose so." A gust of wind howled through the rafters, and somewhere beyond the waiting room, a door creaked, slow and deliberate. Mrs. Hardwick's gloved hands gripped the chair, arms tighter. He wouldn't have gone outside, not in this weather. No one said it, but the unspoken question hummed in the air like a held breath. Where then? Pucken, standing by the doorway, cleared his throat. Maybe he just wanted a bit of space. "Robert doesn't go wandering off." Mrs. Hardwick snapped, her composure cracking like thin ice. Miss Marple smoothed her skirt and stood. "Then perhaps we should find out where he is gone." It was not a suggestion. They searched the waiting room first. Nothing but a few battered benches, an abandoned deck of playing cards on a windowsill. The passenger corridors came next. The old wooden floors, creaking underfoot, the lamps lining the hallway, swayed with the wind, casting flickering light on dust-strewn walls. A door stood ajar to a luggage room, empty, save for a few forgotten trunks. Punks. "No Connell." A side office, papers scattered on the desk, a rusted ticket stamp. "No Connell." Winfield tugged his coat tighter around himself, nervous energy buzzing under his skin. "Can't have just vanished." B.S. Lansing let out a hollow laugh. "No, but it certainly seems he has." Pucken, who had been trailing behind them, suddenly stiffened as they neared the far end of the hallway, where a single door stood shut. "The records office." Miss Marple noted the way his jaw tightened, how his fingers twitched, like a man fighting the urge to reach for something, perhaps a key, perhaps an excuse. Mrs. Hardwick's heels clicked against the wooden floor as she stepped forward. "What about in there?" Pucken didn't answer right away. Instead he squared his shoulders. "That's private property." The room seemed to grow smaller. Beatrix, leaning, folded her arms unimpressed. "Oh, don't be absurd. The Colonel could inside just open it. Pucken, the station master didn't move," I said. "It's private." His voice was even, but there was something beneath it. Not anger, not defiance, something closer to fear. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, observing the way his eyes darted just for a second toward the key, hanging on the wall behind the desk. A moment passed, then another, and then a distant sound from behind the locked door. A low, muffled thump. Pemberton's face drained of color. Mrs. Hardwick's breath hitched Robert. The wind outside screamed, and somewhere just beyond that locked door, something moved. The scream cut through the night like a blade, sharp and jagged, sending a ripple of cold through the station's corridors. It wasn't the kind of scream that mistook a shadow for a ghost, or a rat for a corpse. It was the kind of scream that meant someone had seen something they couldn't unsee. Miss Marple was already rising from her seat by the half when the waiting room door banged open. Beatrix, Lansing, stood in the doorway. Her usual composure rattled like fine china dropped on a stone floor. Her gloves were twisted in one hand, the other pressed against her throat. "Someone's there," she gasped in the god. "I think it's a man in the freight storage bay." Miss Marple's gaze swept across the others. Anthony Winfield had gone pale, his ink-stained fingers tightening around the edges of his coat. Mrs. Hardwick froze, one hand gripping the back of a chair as if to steady herself. Pemberton's face was unreadable, but the way he stared at Beatrix suggested he already knew what she had found. The storm outside had eased, but the wind still whistled through the station's broken rafters as Miss Marple lifted the lantern from this hook by the fireplace. "Well," she said, voice calm as ever, "we had best see what's been found, hadn't we?" The group moved as one, a cluster of shadows weaving their way through the dimly lit corridors. Their footsteps echoed, swallowed quickly by the old stone walls. The freight storage bay lay at the far end of the station, a vast cavernous space filled with the detritus of a place long abandoned, forgotten luggage, wooden crates marked with destinations long since erased by time, an old baggage cart left to rust. The doors stood slightly ajar, swinging gently on their hinges, as though someone had just passed through them. Miss Marple stepped inside, first raising the lantern. The flame cast a pool of flickering light over the crates, illuminating shadows that shifted uneasily in the corners, and then she saw him. Colonel Hardwick lay sprawled behind the disused baggage cart, his body crumpled against the cold stone floor. He had not died. Gracefully, his pocket watch was smashed, the chain broken, its face frozen at exactly 8:20 p.m. Dark stains spread across his shirt, a color that needed no further explanation. His mouth was slightly open as if caught in the middle of a final protest. Miss Marple moved closer, the lantern in her steady hand revealing details like a painter, filling in the final strokes of a grim masterpiece. There was no weapon in sight, no clear sign of struggle, and yet the dust around him had been disturbed. The crates nearby shifted as though someone had fumbled in a hurry. Mrs. Hardwick let out a small, sharp gasp, then her knees buckled. Anthony Winfield barely caught her before she collapsed in a heap, stared at the body, not moving, not speaking. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, the kind that comes when death is no longer just an idea, but something real, something present. Finally, Miss Marple broke it. She exhaled softly, almost thoughtfully, as she set the lantern down beside the body. "Well, now," she murmured, "this is rather inconvenient, isn't it?" And then, lifting her head, she let her sharp eyes sweep across the living faces around her. Because one of them had killed him, the room held its breath. the lantern's flickering light threw long distorted shadows against the freight storage bays, crumbling walls making the gathered figures seem more like apparitions than people. The damp air carried the scent of old wood, rusted metal, and something far fresher, something that no one wanted to name. Mrs. Hardwick remained slumped against Anthony Winfield, her frame small, fragile, as if folding in on itself. Podden stood stiff, his fingers twitching at his sides. Beatrix Lansing's gloved hands were clasped too tightly. Her usual air of casual detachment cracked. And then there was the body. Colonel Hardwick lay sprawled where he had fallen, his back against a stack of abandoned luggage, his legs at an awkward angle. One arm was outstretched, fingers curled slightly, as though reaching for something or someone. The harsh glow of the lantern carved deep lines into his face, leaving shadows to settle in his sunken eyes. The silence threatened to stretch into hysteria, until a voice, cool, measured but well, Miss Marple murmured, smoothing her skirt as she knelt beside the body, the only one in the room not looking for someone else to take charge. "I suppose we ought to make sense of this, shouldn't we?" The others hesitated, caught between fear and the quiet authority of an elderly woman, who did not hesitate at all. Miss Marple reached for the Kell's arm, careful but unflinching as she pressed 2 fingers against his wrist. She already knew what she would find. The flesh was cool, the stillness absolute, but she checked. Anyway, one must be thorough about these things. "It's been dead for a little while now," she said, voice calm as if remarking on a poorly made cup of tea. "The body hasn't quite stiffened, but the temperature suggests." She trailed off, glancing at the watch chain still clutched loosely in the colonel's other hand. The pocket watch had been torn from his waistcoat, its delicate casing cracked, open like a broken promise. The hands were frozen at 8:20 p.m. Miss Marple lifted it gently, tilting it toward the lantern's glow. "Now that is interesting." Anthony Winfield cleared his throat, though it did little to rid him of the jitter in his voice. What's interesting about it?" Miss Marple did not look up. "A broken watch is always interesting, Mr. Winfield. It tells you 2 things: when the damage was done, and whether it was meant to be noticed." She let her eyes travel over the others' weighing reactions. Pompton shifted on his feet, his mouth pressed into a tight, unreadable line. Beatrix Lansing's lips parted as though to object, but no sound followed. Mrs. Hardwick, still trembling, wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. Miss Marple hummed lightly, not quite a tune, but more of a thought-taking shape, and then she saw it near the colonel's outstretched fingers, barely visible in the uneven glow of the lantern. A piece of fabric lay curled against the cold stone floor. Miss Marple reached for it, lifting it between 2 precise fingers. A single embroidered glove, soft, expensive, the initial BL, stitched neatly in the lining. Beatrix Lansing exhaled sharply, her face pale but composed. "Well," she said, voice brittle, "it isn't mine." Pompton made a noise, something between a scoff and a curse. "Then perhaps he just walked here on its own." "Miss Lansing," Miss Marple turned the glove over. No blood, no obvious sign that it had been used in the act, but it was near the body, close enough that someone, perhaps the colonel himself, had tried to grab at it before he collapsed. She tucked it into her handbag, best to hold on to this for now. And then, just as she was about to rise, something else caught her attention. The old baggage cart behind the colonel's body had a smear of something on its handle, faint in the poor light, but distinct upon closer inspection. Miss Marple touched the edge of the stain with the tip of her gloved finger. A metallic scent rose from it, not blood, not entirely. She rubbed it between her fingers, thoughtful. "Well, will," she murmured to herself, standing. Pompton eyed her wearily. "Find something?" "Oh, a few things." Miss Marple smiled faintly, but politely. "The trouble, you see, is deciding what they mean." She stepped back, smoothing down her dress. "It's like a puzzle, isn't it? Some pieces fit together immediately, others you need to wait until the right moment to see where they belong." She turned back to the group. I suppose the question is who left the glove behind, and who left the colonel dead. The storm outside had quieted to a murmur, but inside the real storm was just beginning. Act 2, Miss Marple takes charge. The air inside the freight storage bay had grown thick, not with the damp of the station, nor the lingering smell of old wood and metal, but with the weight of unspoken things. The body lay still, but the tension in the room was alive, winding its way through each person, tightening around their throats. Miss Marple has seen it before, the moment when a room full of people realizes that one among them is a murderer. She set the embroidered glove down carefully at top. A crate brushed the wrinkles from her skirt, and straightened. The men was standing stiff, the women tense, expressions a delicate balance between horror and calculation. "Now then," she said lightly, as though she were preparing a parlor game, rather than addressing a room of potential suspects. "Before we do anything foolish, I believe it would be best to make sure no further mischief is done." Pompton, still lingering near the door, gave her a sharp look. "What are you suggesting?" She turned to him, mild but firm. "Will you knock the doors, Mr. Pompton? No one should be stumbling about near the body, contaminating the scene." His mouth pressed into a thin line. He didn't like the idea, but he wasn't fool enough to argue. Dug a key from his pocket, hesitated, then stepped forward and turned it in the heavy iron lock with a definitive click. Miss Marple gave him an approving nod. "Very good," she said. "Now then, let's all move back to the waiting room." There was a pause, one of those heavy silences where everyone is waiting for someone else to protest first. It was Beatrix Lansing who finally broke it. "I fail to see what good that does," she said, her arms folded in a posture that suggested she had never liked being told what to do. "We need to get help. There must be some way to contact the authorities." Mrs. Hardwick let out a strangled sob, hands trembling as she pressed a crumpled handkerchief to her lips. "She's right," she whispered. We must get the police." Winfield, whose color had not yet recovered, looked anxiously between them. There was a telephone at the front desk, wasn't there? Pompton, still standing by the locked door, shook his head grimly. "You can try, but I'll tell you now, it won't work." All eyes turned to him. "The storm," he said, gesturing toward the rattling windows lines, "went down earlier in the night." Mrs. Hardwick let out a small wounded noise, sinking into the nearest chair like a marionette with its strings cut. "So, what are we to do?" Beatrix demanded. Miss Marple adjusted the cuffs of her cardigan, her voice gentle but unwavering. "For the moment, we stay put." Silence again, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't just the weight of a dead man in the room, it was the weight of a trap closing in. Anthony Winfield shifted his shoes, scraping against the floor. "You think the murderer is still here, Miss Marple?" And there was something sharp beneath it, something that wasn't at all fragile or grandmotherly. "Me, Mr. Winfield," she said pleasantly. "Where else would they be?" She turned, moving toward the door, the others trailing behind her. Behind them, Colonel Hardwick remained exactly where he had fallen, frozen in time, and outside the wind battered against the station, howling like it wanted in. The waiting room of Applecross Station had become something else entirely. A stage, a courtroom, a trap. The flickering light of the oil lanterns cast long shifting shadows across the worn wooden floor, distorting faces just enough to make honest men look guilty and liars seem sincere. Miss Marple sat at the head of the room, not at the center, not looming, but precisely where she needed to be. She had knitted through funerals, whispered past scandals over tea, and seen men break down with a simple, well-placed question. She knew that silence was as much a tool as words. Tonight she had no knitting tonight. She had murder. Leonard Putton sat on the edge of his chair, hunched like a man expecting a fight or a verdict. His uniform, frayed at the cuffs, bore the weight of years where dignity had been traded for survival. "You had a history with Colonel Hardwick," Miss Marple began, voice as light as if she were asking after the weather. Toon exhaled sharply, eyes darting toward the floor before fixing on the lantern glow. I won't deny it. Tell me. The room tightened around them. Waiting Putton fingers twitched. On his knee. Hardwick ruined me, he said at last. Voice rough. 20 years ago, I was a rising man in the railway business, ran Applecross like clockwork, but then there was he. Stopped, glancing up at me. Miss Marple with something almost like reluctance. She nodded just once, coaxing him forward. There was an accident. Putton continued. Freight train derailed just past the switch station. No fatalities, but it was a damned close thing. Hardwick was in charge of the investigation. He was military, had friends in high places. He needed someone to blame, and you were convenient. Pemberton's jaw tightened. I was more than that. I was innocent. The words rang in the stillness. Records were altered, Putton said bitterly. The whole thing got swept away. I lost my post. I lost. He stopped himself, but I stayed. And he went on getting promoted for stepping on men like me. A heavy pause. And now Miss Marple prompted. Pemberton's eyes were dark. And now he's dead. The statement hung there, daring someone to challenge it. You must be relieved. Beatrice Lansing murmured. Putton gave her a look, flat, unreadable. You don't get relief from ghosts, Miss Lansing. They stay with you. Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly against the armrest of her chair, her expression thoughtful yet unreadable. A convenient story, a convenient motive, but convenience wasn't guilt. The room was steeped in the weight of old secrets, the flickering lantern casting long shadows against the walls, as if the very station itself was holding its breath. Mrs. Hardwick had been silent throughout Pemberton's confession, staring blankly at the lantern's glow. Her face, still pale, hands folded tightly in her lap, betrayed a deeper turmoil. When Miss Marple turned to her, she stiffened, like a woman bracing for a blow. Mrs. Hardwick, Miss Marple said gently, do you believe your husband had enemies? A sharp, brittle laugh escaped her lips, so sudden that it startled even herself. Enemies? She repeated, her voice thin and stretched. Of course, Robert collected them the way some men collect cufflinks. A shiver ran through the room, the weight of truth settling at last. Miss Marple waited. If one pressed too soon, the door to the truth would slam shut. Mrs. Hardwick swallowed, shaking her head. But you don't understand. It wasn't just business. It wasn't just men like Pemberton. Her voice dropped, barely more than a breath. He did something terrible. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. To whom? Mrs. Hardwick looked at her, then truly looked at her, and for a moment it seemed she might finally say what had been pressing against her ribs like an iron weight. But then she looked away. I can't, she whispered. Miss Marple inclined her head, accepting an answer that was no answer at all. The truth was there, lingering just beyond reach, unwilling yet to step into the light. Anthony Winfield sat perched on the edge of his seat, too still, his hands knotted together as though afraid they might betray him if left to their own devices. Miss Marple regarded him mildly. Mr. Winfield, I believe you were lurking near the records office earlier this evening. His fingers twitched. Lurking? A rather unfortunate word, I grant you, but not, I think, inaccurate. Winfield licked his lips, casting a glance toward the others. His hesitation was telling. Oh, he exhaled, shoulders slumping. I wasn't doing anything criminal, I swear. Beatrice scoffed. That's exactly what people say before they're arrested. Winfield glared at her, then sighed. I was just curious, he admitted, his voice lowering. I know something about the old freight scandal. I saw a name in an old ledger once, years ago. It's haunted me ever since. I thought maybe if I could just check the files. His voice trailed off, guilt and uncertainty warring in his eyes. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And what name were you looking for, Mr. Winfield? He hesitated, then finally muttered, Hardwick. A soft, collective intake of breath. Pemberton exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Of course he was involved in that. It all makes sense now. Miss Marple sat back, her expression thoughtful, but something was missing. The threads were coming together, yet the tapestry remained incomplete. The wind outside howled again, rattling the windows. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and smiled faintly. "Yes," she murmured, mostly to herself. "It all makes sense, but not in the way any of them expected." The storm had passed, but Applecross Station remained wrapped in its own kind of hush. The early morning drizzle tapped soft, insistent fingers against the roof. The wind, though calmer now, still whispered along the eaves, rattling old timbers like a reminder. Inside, the station stirred. Sleep had been fitful. If anyone had truly slept at all, a night spent in the company of a murderer does little for restful slumber. Miss Marple had risen before dawn. Old habits. People gave themselves away in the quiet hours when they thought no one was watching. But she was always watching, with a lantern in one hand and a sharp eye for details that others missed. She stepped carefully into the corridor leading to the freight storage bay. The floor bore a story, smudges and streaks, the dirt and damp from last night's storm leaving their mark. In the dim glow of her lantern, she saw a trail of muddy footprints winding toward the locked storage bay. She crouched, inspecting them closely. The prints varied. Some were broad, likely from Pemberton's heavy station boots. Others were finer, narrower. She followed them back along the corridor, her mind piecing together who had walked here, and when. One set stood out. Small, close-together steps, hesitant, almost furtive. Miss Marple straightened, the lantern's glow casting sharp relief on the door ahead. Her pulse remained steady, but a flicker of knowing crossed her features. The truth was near. With one gloved hand, she turned the rusting handle. The door creaked open, revealing the darkness beyond. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew, the final piece of the puzzle was waiting for her inside. Gaze flicked toward the waiting room where Anthony Winfield sat rubbing his temples, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose. She straightened her lips, pressing into a faint smile. "Well," she murmured, "curiosity does tend to leave tracks. The records office had been left unlocked sometime in the night. That was interesting." Miss Marple pushed the door open, stepping into the scent of old paper and dust, the kind that settled deep in the bones of a place long neglected. A lone wooden desk sat beneath a flickering oil lamp, its surface worn by years of signatures, schedules, and decisions that had sent trains and men alike to places they ought never have gone. She scanned the shelves. Most of the logs were untouched, their bindings stiff with disuse, but one section gaped open, a few loose pages curling at the edges as though torn hastily from a ledger. Miss Marple ran a gloved hand over the empty space where they should have been. There were two possibilities. Someone had taken those pages to hide something, or someone had taken them because they already knew exactly what was missing. She suspected the latter. Her fingers traced the spine of a thick register, flipping it open with care. The remaining entries were fascinating. Even in their absence, dates, numbers, train schedules from 20 years ago, the same year as Pemberton's scandal, the same year Hardwick had made his career by investigating a railway disaster. She turned the pages, her mind fitting together the shape of something just out of reach. She closed the ledger and stepped back into the corridor where the dawn light was beginning to creep through the broken station. Windows casting long golden bars against the damp floor, and there, half hidden beneath a bench just outside the waiting room, something caught the light. A glove, not just any glove. Miss Marple crouched and retrieved it, turning it over in her hands. Fine material, a delicate embroidered initial sewn into the lining. B. L. Beatrick, Lansing. Miss Marple stood brushing the damp from her fingers and studied the empty hallway. Someone had dropped it here, perhaps in haste, perhaps in panic, and yet Beatrick had claimed it wasn't hers. Miss Marple smiled to herself. tucking the glove carefully into her handbag. "Oh, my dear," she murmured, not without amusement, "you must be more careful where you leave your things," and with that she turned back toward the waiting room, where the suspects, some guilty, some merely afraid, waited for the morning to decide their fate. The booking hall of Applecross Station had never felt more like a courtroom. Miss Marple sat in one of the wooden chairs near the unmanned ticket counter, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the station's gloom pressed inward, the weak morning light filtering through grimy windows, illuminating more dust than truth. The others sat or stood before her, lined up like actors in a play, waiting for their cues. The body of Colonel Hardwick was gone, locked away in the freight storage bay, but his presence lingered, hanging heavy in the air. Miss Marple had spent a lifetime listening to village gossip, to hurried confessions made over tea, to silences that meant more than words. She listened now as much to what was not said as to what was. Beatrice Lansing sat stiff back in a chair, her lips a thin taut line. "You claim," Miss Marple said presently, "that you were in the waiting room the entire evening." "Yes." Beatrice's voice was crisp, the edges of her composure razor sharp. "I never left. I would have no reason to." Miss Marple tilted her head, considering, and yet she murmured, "Your glove was found near the freight storage bay." A small visible shudder ran through Beatrice before she tightened her jaw. "That means nothing. Someone must have taken it, stolen it from my coat pocket." Miss Marple tapped a gloved finger lightly against the armrest of her chair. "And yet you claim last night wasn't yours at all." Beatrice hesitated just for a moment before recovering. "I was startled, and really, Mrs. Marple, must we fixate on a glove when there's a murderer among us?" Miss Marple smiled, soft but sharp. "A glove is a very interesting thing, Miss Laney. It covers the hand after all, and hands," she paused, letting the words sink in, "are what commit murder." Beatrice exhaled sharply, crossing her arms. "You've got it wrong, Miss Marple." Let the silence settle before turning her gaze to Anthony Winfield. The young man sat hunched forward, rubbing his ink-stained fingers together. He looked like he hadn't slept, perhaps because he hadn't. "Mr. Winfield," Miss Marple said, "you were seen near the records office last night." His jaw clenched. "I wasn't doing anything illegal." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "That wasn't what I asked." A bead of sweat formed at his temple. "I was looking for proof," he admitted. "Finally, proof of what?" Winfield took a deep breath, as if weighing how much to say. His glasses slipped down his nose and he pushed them back up before answering. "I used to." He stopped himself, cleared his throat. "There was a time I was very good at making things disappear. Paperwork, mostly. I forged documents. A long time ago." Beatrice made a sound in her throat, something between a scoff and a laugh. "A forger? Well, that's rich." Winfield's hands curled into fists. "I stopped years ago. I've been trying to make things right." He looked at Miss Marple, eyes dark with something close to desperation. "That's why I was in the records office. I needed proof that Hardwick was doing exactly what I used to do." Miss Marple waited. Winfield exhaled shakily. "He was blackmailing people using old railway logs, records of accidents, missing shipments, falsified reports. If he had dirt on someone, he used it. I was trying to find out how many people he destroyed." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did you find what you were looking for?" Winfield hesitated. "No," he admitted, "because someone else got there first. The old logs were already gone." She studied him. A guilty man could lie convincingly, but a frightened one rarely knew how to hide the truth. Finally she turned to Mrs. Hardwick. The Colonel's widow sat with a stiff sort of grace, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She had not spoken much since the body was found, and now as Miss Marple's attention turned to her, her shoulders tensed like a violin string about to snap. "Mrs. Hardwick," Miss Marple said, her tone gentler than before, "you said last night that your husband had many enemies. Mrs. Hardwick swallowed. Yes, and he had debts. A slight nod. What kind of debts? For a moment, the only sound in the station was the steady patter of rain against the windows. Then very softly, Mrs. Hardwick said, "Debts of honor." Beatrix made a disbelieving noise. Honor? Mrs. Hardwick's gaze snapped to her, and for the first time that night, her voice held steel. He wasn't always a cruel man. Miss Marple did not interrupt. She let the woman find her own words. He owed money, Mrs. Hardwick admitted, not looking at anyone directly, to the sort of people one does not refuse, and so he found ways to pay, using what he knew. What he had buried. Winfield's head jerked up. "You mean the blackmail?" Mrs. Hardwick flinched, but she didn't deny it. "He was desperate," she murmured. "I tried to make him stop, but it was never enough. He said there was one last payment to be made." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And you know who that payment was meant for?" Mrs. Hardwick's hands trembled. "No," she whispered. Miss Marple let out a soft sigh, leaning back in her chair. The pieces were falling into place, but there were still too many gaps. A glove that should not have been found, a past that refused to stay buried, a debt that had to be paid, and the murderer who was running out of places to hide. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, surveying the uneasy faces before her. "Well," she said lightly, "this is all rather illuminating, isn't it?" Her voice was calm. Her eyes were not. The air inside Applecross Station was thick, a weight pressing down on the occupants like an unspoken accusation. It was midday, but the light barely touched the place. The sky remained overcast, and the dim glow from the oil lamps made the station feel more like a room with the curtains drawn against reality. The exhaustion was showing. No one had slept well. The strain of spending the night in a place haunted by murder and suspicion was beginning to fray the edges of even the most composed. Miss Marple, seated in her usual, assuming manner, observed the room through half-lidded eyes, a picture of serenity that was entirely deceptive. She could see it, the way nerves were stretched thin, the way hands twitched, voices snapped a little too quickly. It was time to test the limits of their stories. Leonard Putton leaned against the doorway, arms crossed over his chest. He had the look of a man who had carried too many burdens for too long, and had grown comfortable in his resentment. "I told you already," he grumbled. "I was checking the damn generator. You all want the lights on, don't you?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap at precisely 8:20 p.m. Putton gave a sharp nod. "Yes, and where is the generator located?" "Storage room past the ticket office." Miss Marple tilted her head quite far from the freight storage bay. "Wouldn't you say?" Putton shifted his fingers, tapping impatiently against his sleeve. "I wasn't near the freight bay, if that's what you're asking." "It's not what I'm asking," Miss Marple said mildly. "It's what I'm confirming." She let the silence stretch before adding, "And did anyone see you there?" Putton's jaw tightened. "No, I was alone." A rather unfortunate thing, being alone at the precise moment of a murder. Putton exhaled sharply through his nose. "I don't care what it sounds like. I was there. I had work to do." Miss studied him a moment longer, then nodded. "Of course, but you must admit it's terribly convenient that no one can say for certain." Pemberton's fingers curled into a fist, but he said nothing. Beatrix Laning had maintained an air of crisp elegance throughout the night's ordeal, but now the strain was beginning to show. Her composure was still in place, but it had become a brittle thing, liable to snap. "I was with Mrs. Hardwick," she said, voice clipped, etching blankets. "Surely that puts me in the clear." Miss Marple turned her gaze toward Mrs. Hardwick, who sat in a fragile hush. "Mrs. Hardwick," Miss Marple said gently, "can you confirm that?" Mrs. Hardwick hesitated too long. She opened her mouth, closed it, then pressed shaking fingers against her forehead. "I don't know." Beatrice's head snapped toward her, a flicker of something dangerous. flashing in her eyes. "We went together," she insisted. Miss Marple's tone remained polite, but her eyes were sharp. "But where exactly did you go?" Beatrix exhaled in frustration. "I told you, down the main corridor past the first storage room. I reached for the door, but it was locked." Miss Marple blinked. "Locked?" Beatrix folded her arms. "Yes, it wouldn't budge. So I turned back." "That's odd." Miss Marple used. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "What's odd about it?" Miss Marple smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes because that particular storage room has no lock. Beatrix stilled her mask slipping. For just a fraction of a second, Miss Marple let the revelation settle before continuing, her voice perfectly even. "And you see, if a door without a lock does not open, it can only mean one of two things. Either someone was holding it closed from the other side," she let that hang for a moment, "or there was never a locked door at all." Beatrice's fingers tightened into fists in her lap. "Are you accusing me of lying?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh no, dear. I simply think you may be remembering things rather conveniently." Beatrix exhaled sharply, but she didn't argue, which was more telling than if she had. The atmosphere in the station had shifted. The threads of their stories weren't quite lining up. And now everyone could feel it. Putin was trapped in his solitary alibi. Beatrix Lansing was tangled in the contradictions of her own words. Mrs. Hardwick sat like a woman who was holding something back, something she couldn't say, or perhaps something she was too afraid to admit, even to herself. Miss Marple took it all in a faulty memory, a lonely excuse, a door that had never been locked. The murderer was in this room, and soon they would have nowhere left to hide. The corridor stretched out in long dim shadows, the flickering oil lamp casting a weak glow against the damp stone walls. The waiting room behind them still buzzed with tension, muttered accusations, uneasy glances, the kind of nervous energy that brews in the presence of a murderer. Miss Marple, however, had always known that the most important confessions were never made in a crowded room. She walked quietly beside Mrs. Hardwick, matching her slower, more delicate steps. The woman looked as if the weight of the past few hours had settled into her very bones, making her smaller, frailer than she had appeared. The night before, at last, near an old temple board, Miss Marple spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "You knew, of course," she said, "that your husband had more enemies than he could count." Mrs. Hardwick halted, her fingers tightening around the handkerchief she'd been twisting in her lap all morning. She let out a breath, weary as if she had spent years holding something in, and had only just realized it. "Yes," she whispered. "I knew for a moment." Neither woman spoke. The storm had left the station with a heavy dampness, the air still thick with the scent of rain and cold dust. Somewhere in the distance, loose shutter rattled, then fell silent. Mrs. Hardwick turned to Miss Marple, her tired eyes searching the older woman's face as though debating whether it was safe to speak at all. And then she made her choice. Elard Putin didn't cause that railway accident 20 years ago, she said. Robert did. Miss Marple was not surprised, though. She made a small murmured sound of encouragement. Mrs. Hardwick went on, her voice. "Horror Pimpton was an easy target. He had no connections, no influence. My husband needed a scapegoat, and Putin was there, young, ambitious, and in the wrong place at the wrong time." Miss Marple studied her, noting the way she spoke, carefully, deliberately, as if each word was a step across thin ice. "Putin never had a chance." Mrs. Hardwick continued the official investigation. "Robert controlled it. And then came the falsified reports, the testimonies that suddenly changed. He made sure Putin would be disgraced forever." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "And you let him?" Mrs. Hardwick flinched just barely. She stopped. "I didn't know, not at first. By the time I learned the truth, it was too late. Robert had already won." She let out a hollow, bitter laugh. That was how he operated. Always a step ahead, always knowing how to bury a thing before it became a problem. Miss Marple's eyes darkened her mind, assembling the missing pieces. Robert Hardwick had built his career on ruining men like Putin, and when the past had threatened to surface, he had turned to blackmail, but someone had decided they wouldn't let him bury the truth again. Mrs. Hardwick leaned against the cold stone wall, pressing the handkerchief to her temple, as though she could rub away the years it never stopped. She murmured, blackmail. It wasn't just about Putin. It was everyone, officers, politicians, businessmen. He knew how to dig up dirt, and how to make them pay for their silence. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, and yet even he must have known that one day he'd push someone too far. Mrs. Hardwick's lips pressed into a thin line. Precise moment of a murder. Putin exhaled sharply through his nose. I don't care what it sounds like. I was there, I had work to do. Miss studied him a moment longer, then nodded. Of course, but you must admit it's terribly convenient that no one can say for certain. Pemberton's fingers curled into a fist. But he said nothing. Beatrix Laning had maintained an air of crisp elegance throughout the night's ordeal, but now the strain was beginning to show. Her composure was still in place, but it had become a brittle thing, liable to snap. I was with Mrs. Hardwick, she said, voice clipped, etching blankets. Surely that puts me in the clear. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward Mrs. Hardwick, who sat in a fragile hush. Mrs. Hardwick. Miss Marple said gently, can you confirm that Mrs. Hardwick hesitated too long? She opened her mouth, closed it, then pressed shaking fingers against her forehead. I don't know. Beatrice's head snapped toward her, a flicker of something dangerous flashing in her eyes. We went together. She insisted. Miss Marple's tone remained polite, but her eyes were sharp. But where exactly did you go? Beatrix exhaled in frustration. I told you, down the main corridor past the first storage room. I reached for the door, but it was locked. Miss Marple blinked. Locked? Beatrix folded her arms. Yes, it wouldn't budge. So I turned back. That's odd. Miss Marple used. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. What's odd about it? Miss Marple smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes because that particular storage room has no lock. Beatrix stilled, her mask slipping. For just a fraction of a second, Miss Marple let the revelation settle before continuing, her voice perfectly even. And you see, if a door without a lock does not open, it can only mean one of two things. Either someone was holding it closed from the other side, she let that hang for a moment, or there was never a locked door at all. Beatrice's fingers tightened into fists in her lap. Are you accusing me of lying? Miss Marple tilted her head. Oh no, dear. I simply think you may be remembering things rather conveniently. Beatrix exhaled sharply, but she didn't argue, which was more telling than if she had. The atmosphere in the station had shifted. The threads of their stories weren't quite lining up, and now everyone could feel it. Putin was trapped in his solitary alibi. Beatrix Lansing was tangled in the contradictions of her own words. Mrs. Hardwick sat like a woman who was holding something back, something she couldn't say, or perhaps something she was too afraid to admit, even to herself. Miss Marple took it all in a faulty memory, a lonely excuse, a door that had never been locked. The murderer was in this room, and soon they would have nowhere left to hide. The corridor stretched out in long dim shadows, the flickering oil lamp casting a weak glow against the damp stone walls. The waiting room behind them still buzzed with tension, muttered accusations, uneasy glances, the kind of nervous energy that brews in the presence of a murderer. Miss Marple, however, had always known that the most important confessions were never made in a crowded room. She walked quietly beside Mrs. Hardwick, matching her slower, more delicate steps. The woman looked as if the weight of the past few hours had settled into her very bones, making her smaller, frailer than she had appeared. The night before, at last, near an old Temable board, Miss Marple spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "You knew, of course. She said that your husband had more enemies than he could count." Mrs. Hardwick halted, her fingers tightening around the handkerchief she'd been twisting in her lap all morning. She let out a breath, weary as if she had spent years holding something in, and had only just realized it. "Yes," she whispered. "I knew for a moment." Neither woman spoke. The storm had left the station with a heavy dampness, the air still thick with the scent of rain and cold dust. Somewhere in the distance, loose shutter rattled, then fell silent. Mrs. Hardwick turned to Miss Marple, her tired eyes searching the older woman's face as though debating whether it was safe to speak at all. And then she made her choice. "Elard Poton didn't cause that railway accident 20 years ago," she said. "Robert did." Miss Marple was not surprised, though. She made a small murmured sound of encouragement. Mrs. Hardwick went on, her voice. "Horror Pimpton was an easy target. He had no connections, no influence. My husband needed a scapegoat, and Poton was there, young, ambitious, and in the wrong place at the wrong time." Miss Marple studied her, noting the way she spoke, carefully, deliberately, as if each word was a step across thin ice. "Poton never had a chance." Mrs. Hardwick continued the official investigation. "Robert controlled it. And then came the falsified reports, the testimonies that suddenly changed. He made sure Poton would be disgraced forever." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "And you let him?" Mrs. Hardwick flinched just barely. She stopped. "I didn't know, not at first. By the time I learned the truth, it was too late. Robert had already won." She let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "That was how he operated. Always a step ahead, always knowing how to bury a thing before it became a problem." Miss Marple's eyes darkened, her mind assembling the missing pieces. Robert Hardwick had built his career on ruining men like Poton, and when the past had threatened to surface, he had turned to blackmail, but someone had decided they wouldn't let him bury the truth again. Mrs. Hardwick leaned against the cold stone wall, pressing the handkerchief to her temple, as though she could rub away the years it never stopped. She murmured, "Blackmail. It wasn't just about Poton. It was everyone, officers, politicians, businessmen. He knew how to dig up dirt, and how to make them pay for their silence." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet even he must have known that one day he'd push someone too far." Mrs. Hardwick's lips pressed into a thin line. "Truth," she murmured. Beatrix gave a small broken laugh. "Not until recently I found letters, old correspondences between Hardwick and my father. It was all there. He had been blackmailing him, bleeding him dry until there was nothing left." Her fingers tightened into fists. "So I came here. I wanted to confront him. I wanted him to pay for what he did. But I didn't kill him." A beat. Miss Marple watched her closely, and then a soft exhale. "No," Miss Marple said finally. "I don't believe you did." Beatrice's head snapped up. "But someone did." Miss Marple continued, looking at each and every person in the room. Her voice, still quiet, still gentle, carried more weight than the storm outside ever had. "And it's time," she said, "to bring them into the light." The room stilled, and somewhere outside the thunder finally ceased. The waiting room of Applecross Station felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in around them. The air, thick with the scent of smoke and damp wool, carried the weight of too many unspoken fears. Outside, the sky remained a bruised shade of grey, the last remnants of the storm grumbling low over the hills inside. No one spoke, no one moved. They were waiting for the moment when one among them would no longer be a suspect, but a murderer. Miss Marple sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression almost mild, but her gaze sharp as a blade, and just as unforgiving. She let the silence stretch. Then softly, "I imagine it wasn't planned," she said. Her voice was gentle, almost conversational. way one might coax a confession from a frightened child across from her. Beatrix Lansing didn't move. Not at first. You lured him to the storage bay. Miss Marple continued, her tone unsoothing, but unyielding. Didn't you, my dear? Beatrix exhaled sharply, but she still wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. Miss Marple watched her carefully. You knew he was expecting payment, she went on. A final installment, perhaps, to close out one of his many, shall we call them, debts? Beatrice's shoulders stiffened. You told him you had the money, that he should meet you in the freight storage bay. Away from prying eyes, the others in the room, frozen, their breath held as if any sound might shatter the delicate balance of the moment. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. But you didn't bring him money, did you? Slowly Beatrix lifted her head, her eyes so carefully guarded, so well practiced in deception, but now just tired. You have no proof, she murmured. But the words lacked conviction. Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear, proof is a peculiar thing, she said. It's not always found in what is seen, but rather in what cannot be explained. Away she gestured lightly with one hand. The glove, the footprints, the missing railway logs, the Colonel's broken watch. That last detail made Beatrix flinch. You see, Miss Marple continued, when someone dies in a moment of surprise or panic, they often leave behind a single truth. They didn't mean to. She leaned forward slightly. The Colonel's watch stopped at precisely 8:20 p.m. when it was smashed against the ground. Miss Marple let the words sink in. You struck him, Miss Lansing, didn't you? Beatrice's lips parted slightly, but no sound came. A moment passed, then another, and then her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists against the fabric of her dress. Yes, she whispered. The confession didn't feel like a victory. It was a slow collapse. I met him there, she said, her voice flat, detached, as if the words were spilling from someone else's lips. I wanted to confront him, to make him admit what he'd done. A ragged breath. He just laughed at me. Her hands trembled. Now, he said, I was a fool, that I would never be free of him, that I was just like my father, weak, pathetic. The words caught in her throat, and then her voice broke, and then I hit him. Silence. No one moved. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but there was no softness to the truth. You used the iron lever from the baggage cart. Beatrix nodded, her expression unreadable. He fell back. I thought he would get up, but he didn't. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I watched the blood spread. I remember the sound of the watch shattering when he hit the floor, and then she exhaled sharply. I ran. Miss Marple gave a slow, measured nod. And in your haste you dropped your glove, she murmured. Beatrice's mouth twisted in a grim, humorous smile. Fitting, isn't it? She murmured. My father lost everything because of a single missing document, and I lost everything because of a single missing glove. She let out a breath that sounded too much like relief, I suppose, she said quietly. That's what you'd call justice. The room remained silent, as Beatrix Lansing sat back, eyes closed, hands resting in her lap, like she was finally free of a weight she had carried for too long. Powton looked away, his jaw tight with something like understanding. Anthony Winfield sat frozen, still pale, still processing, and Mrs. Hardwick, she simply stared at the floor as if she had known all along that it would come to this. Miss Marple sat back, watching them. All the storm had passed. The train would eventually come, and Beatrix Lansing would leave Applecross Station in handcuffs. But in the end, that wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the truth, and the truth had finally been spoken. The storm had spent itself by dawn. The sky had washed clean, a pale shade of blue, stretching over the hills. The air crisp with a kind of cold that cleared the senses. The ground still held the memory of rain puddles forming in the uneven cracks of the station platform, soaking into the wooden steps that led down to the railway. The waiting room of Applecross Station was silent, the tension that had gripped it, now unwinding, unraveling in slow, tired breaths. But the weight of the night's events remained. Miss Marple sat by the window watching as a lone motor car rumbled down the muddy road, kicking up water as it approached. The local constable stepped out, adjusting his cap. Against the cold, he was a stocky man, his uniform slightly too tight at the buttons, his eyes sharp at tired. "Which one?" he asked briskly, stamping his feet to shake off the morning chill. Miss Marple rose from her chair, folding her hands neatly. "She's outside," she murmured. "Patrick." Of the station steps, her coat pulled tight around her as the wind cut through the morning stillness. Her face was pale, but there were no more sharp retorts, no brittle defenses. She had nothing left to argue. The constable approached, his expression unreadable. "Patrick." Lancing. "I'll need you to come with me for a moment." She didn't move. Then, with a slow, measured breath, she nodded. Her heels clicked softly against the wood as she descended the stairs, her steps deliberate, unhurried. The wind caught the hem of her coat, lifting it slightly, as though trying to pull her back to keep her from leaving the station behind. Miss Marple followed at a distance, observing as Patrick reached the bottom step. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, her fingers clenched at her sides, her throat bobbed, as though she meant to say something to someone, maybe to no one. Then she exhaled, and the moment passed. The constable opened the door of the motor car, and Patrick stepped inside as the door clicked shut. Miss Marple saw the first tears slip down Beatrice's cheek. It mingled with the rain, and then she was gone. At the edge of the platform, Leonard Putton stood apart from the others, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. His face was unreadable, but Miss Marple had long since learned how to read the silence of a man who carried too much of the past on his shoulders. She walked toward him, her steps unhurried, her presence unintrusive. "It'll be opening an investigation into Hardwick's dealings," she said mildly. "I imagine your name will surface in it, Mr. Putton." A short laugh escaped him. "Not humor, not relief, just something tired that's supposed to make me feel better." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "It means people will finally know the truth." Putton let out a breath, turning toward her. "But it won't change anything, will it?" he said quietly. Miss Marple tilted her head, considering. "No," she admitted, "but the truth has a way of settling in the end, even if it took longer than it should." Putton looked away, his fingers tightening against the fabric of his coat. "Hardwick took 20 years from me," he murmured. 20 years, my career, my reputation, and now he's dead, and I don't even know how I feel about it." Miss Marple regarded him carefully, her gaze steady, yet understanding. "Perhaps," she said softly, "because there's nothing left to feel. It was taken from you long ago." Putton swallowed, his jaw working as he absorbed the words. Then, after a long moment, he gave a slight nod. "I suppose," he said, exhaling deeply. "That will have to do." Miss Marple didn't answer. Instead, she turned toward the distant hills, watching as the motorcar carrying Patrick Lansing disappeared beyond the mist. Applecross Station, once a place of secrets and silence, was quiet once more, but now at least the truth had been spoken, and sometimes that was all that mattered. By midday, Applecross Station had begun returning to what it had always been, a quiet, forgotten place where the wind carried whispers of journeys taken long ago. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a washed-out shade of blue, streaked with pale sunlight that cast long shadows across the platform. The air smelled fresh, tinged with damp earth and something else, something lingering from the night before. Inside the waiting room, Miss Marple and Mrs. Hardwick sat across from each other, a single pot of tea between them. The station was calmer now, but the previous night's events still clung to the walls, like the scent of burnt wick after a candle has been snuffed out. Mrs. Hardwick stirred her tea absently, her eyes distant. Beatrix never had a chance, she murmured. Not really. Miss Marple's gaze was sympathetic, but steady. No, she said simply, she didn't. There was no triumph in solving this case, only a weary inevitability. No winner, no true justice, just the truth, heavy and unchangeable. Mrs. Hardwick let out a slow breath, watching the steam curl from her cup. And the others, she asked. The men Hardwick blackmailed, the ones he still had his hooks in. Miss Marple sighed softly. Some will be relieved he's gone, she said. Some will be frightened of what comes next. And others, she paused, her fingers tapping lightly against the delicate rim of her teacup. Others will take his place. A chill settled between them, despite the warmth of the tea. Mrs. Hardwick's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. Then it wasn't really justice at all, was it? Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, considering. Justice, she said, is rarely perfect. It comes in fragments, in half measures. It rarely cleans the slate. More often than not, it leaves behind just enough to remind us that some things never fully disappear. Mrs. Hardwick said nothing, but her expression spoke of a woman who had learned that lesson long ago. Miss Marple took another sip of her tea. It's not about wiping away the past, my dear, she said gently. It's about making sure the right people carry its weight. Beyond the window, a handful of travelers waited on the platform, shifting their suitcases, glancing at their watches. The train would be here soon. Miss Marple watched them, her sharp eyes noting the unconcerned ease with which they stood, oblivious to the drama that had played out in this forgotten station the night before. A few feet away, Leonard Punton lingered near the ticket counter, his hands in his pockets, his gaze lost somewhere in the distance. His name might never be fully cleared, but for the first time in years he wasn't carrying the burden of a lie he hadn't told. Miss Marple had seen it before, the hollow victory of the falsely accused. Some truths set men free, others simply left them adrift. The train's whistle echoed across the station, its deep metallic groan cutting through the still morning air. Miss Marple gathered her handbag, smoothing her skirt before rising. Mrs. Hardwick glanced up at her. "You're leaving then?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "There's nothing left to be done here," she said. "The past has already settled into its proper place." Mrs. Hardwick looked as though she might argue, but instead only nodded. Miss Marple turned toward the door, stepping out onto the platform bathed in thin winter sunlight. She took a final glance at Applecross Station, a place that had once held secrets in its walls, in its ledges, in its locked doors. Secrets that had been dragged into the light. She boarded the train without looking back. Justice had been served, not perfectly, but enough.